is Paul LaRue, and I would like to welcome you to the African American Civil War Museum. As a high school teacher, I can't think of a better place to get some of the valuable information that we need. Throughout this series, we're going to be talking about teaching strategies with 3 videos which we call Teaching Place with the United States Colored Troops. One of the things that we will see throughout this are tips as well as strategies and tools so the teacher who, as you know, doesn't have enough time to get all the things done that needs to happen will hopefully be able to be more successful. We will be doing 3 basic videos, one involving maps, one involving close reading strategies, and the other involving other primary sources. When I entered the classroom in 1985, I as a teacher had a lot of flexibility. One of the things today, teachers with the additional materials that they have been, with state standards and other things, teachers have less time, so they have to become very good time managers. Hopefully these tools and strategies will help teachers become good time managers while still being able to tell the rich story of the United States Colored Troops and these brave African American men who fought to defend our country.
But let's talk about maps. If you are an elementary school teacher, one of the basic skills is map skills. This concept of place. I have 4 maps that you will be using here for, and again, I'll show you ways that you can, strategies that you can use these. First off, I broke these into 4 categories. It is interesting to note as a teacher, many students, especially younger students, don't realize the large number of free people of African descent living in the United States on the eve of the American Civil War. And again, it's interesting to look at the map. And again, Maryland has the largest free African American population at that time of 83,000. We will be talking about some other points. For instance, one of the Civil War spots we visit is Point Lookout, which has, of course, a direct tie to the state of Maryland. But it's interesting that there were nearly 500,000 free people of African descent living in the United States on the eve of the Civil War. The second map shows slave populations. And again, it shows the slave populations by the largest number of states, and the total population comes in just a little under 4 million. So on the eve of the American Civil War, roughly 12% of the people of African descent living in the United States were free, and the rest were enslaved. For students in the elementary, one of the things you can do is you can have them take that information and turn it into a bar graph. You can have them do distances. But again, a lot of schools, especially in the 3rd grade and 4th grade, start to talk about American history topics, possibly the Underground Railroad. And again, those topics lend themselves very well to the use of these maps. Then I gave 2 other maps which showed the number of United States colored troops who enlisted according to the states. And again, it's very interesting when you look at the number of troops. And one of the things that jumps out at you is many more enslaved people enlisted than free. But again, you go down through, and it's interesting to see where the largest number came from. If you're in high school, you can start to use this data and start to do some other kind of interesting things. One of the things that's interesting to note, Massachusetts, which has 3 of the most famous regiments, the Massachusetts 54th, 55th, and 5th Colored Cavalry, come from a state that has a relatively small free African American population. So one of the things that's interesting to talk about is, well, if Massachusetts only has about 4,000 African American free people living in their state in 1860, how are they able to fill 3 regiments? And of course, the reality is they were able to fill 3 regiments because they were able to get recruits from New York, Pennsylvania, my home state of Ohio. Many other states provided manpower. And in fact, under the lesson plans that are here, you'll see a link to a project that I did, in fact, talking about this whole concept. So maps can be used in a lot of ways, and it can really do some kind of thought-provoking, an interesting place when we talk about place is Roosevelt Island in the District of Columbia. Roosevelt Island was actually the training ground for African Americans who had enlisted in the United States Colored Troops in D.C. And if you go to the numbers on the map, you will notice that the District of Columbia had over 3,000 African Americans who enlisted. So maps, I think, when you can't talk about place and not use maps. And again, as a skill, you could put up a single map and have a discussion. You could have students do a quick analysis, looking at again the populations of free versus enslaved, and then looking at where the men enlisted from. Close reading is where you use a short nonfiction text, and then you have higher level learning questions associated with it. Versus the old days when maybe you gave someone a chapter to read or 6 or 7 pages to read. So close reading is an important skill, and it's terribly useful in either English language arts, obviously in history, but it is an important skill that's tied with the Common Core. One of the things that you can do is you can use the United States Colored Troop as a way to do these types of close reading pieces. The essential question here is, how were these soldiers treated in battle? What did they say? What did they do? And there's a couple of really good ways to do this. One of the really interesting ways to do this is by looking at soldiers' letters. There are a large number of USCT soldiers who wrote letters. Some were written during the war, some were written after the war, and they all give a glimpse or a highlight into what life was for these men of African descent as they were fighting, for their country, whether they had been originally enslaved or free. The first letter I would like to touch on is the Robert Penn letter. Robert Penn was an Ohioan, so he was born a free man, although in the letter he talks about issues. Though he grew up in a free state, he certainly did not feel equal by any stretch of the imagination. And then he talks about his battle experience. Now, what's interesting here is he doesn't go into a lot of detail, and some soldiers do and some don't. But he talks about at the end of the letter being at the Battle of New Market Heights. New Market Heights in Virginia is another one of those places that we're very, that we tie into. What's significant about Robert Penn, he was a recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor for his bravery in the battle. He and several other sergeants, when other officers had been killed, stepped up and led their men in combat. And for this, he was a recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor. The other thing that is interesting about this, he lost the use of his right arm in the war, and in fact writes this with his left hand. And so we get into other issues of veterans, issues that veterans had to deal with.
There's no better place for us to complete our journey of African American Civil War soldiers than at the African American Civil War Memorial. This is a tribute to the over 200,000 African American soldiers who served in the Union Army, representing nearly 10% of the Union forces. These men of African descent gave their all, whether they were from free or enslaved groups when they started. They ended serving for their country.